The night smelled of rain and rusted iron, the kind of night when silence feels heavier than sound. Under a broken street lamp, a small puppy shivered, ribs outlined beneath his matted fur, eyes glazed with hunger and fear. His paws pressed into the wet pavement, trembling not just from the cold, but from the terrible vastness of being utterly alone. Each passing car rattled his bones, each gust of wind threatened to carry him into darkness. He didn't understand why the world had abandoned him. He only knew the sharp gnaw in his belly, the sting of raindrops on his raw skin, the ache of waiting for footsteps that never came. And yet, even in his exhaustion, he lifted his head whenever shadows approached, hope stubbornly alive in the cracked glass of his eyes. It was in this fragile pause between survival and surrender that a stranger appeared. A figure bent low, palm extended, voice trembling with warmth. One human touch, hesitant, gentle, real, would begin the story that neither would ever forget. The rain came down in sheets that night, hammering the city with the kind of relentless rhythm that seeps into the bones. It rattled on tin roofs, streamed down gutters clogged with leaves, and drummed against the hollow skin of an overturned dumpster. Beneath that metal shell, pressed into a shallow patch of dry ground, a puppy curled his trembling body tighter, as though he could fold himself out of existence. His fur was more shadow than coat now, clumped and slicked with oil and dirt. His belly had long forgotten the weight of food, replaced instead with the gnawing ache of hunger that never seemed to rest. Each crack of thunder made him flinch, each flash of lightning illuminated his tiny prison, a labyrinth of trash bags, broken glass and the sour stench of decay. Yet in those flashes, the world outside looked wide open and dangerous. For days, perhaps weeks, though time had lost its edges, he had learned to hide, to wait, to survive by silence. But silence carried its own weight, heavy and suffocating, as though the city itself had forgotten him. Somewhere above, a car sped by, tires slicing through puddles, sending a spray of dirty water against the metal walls that sheltered him. The noise echoed, making the pup's ears flatten against his skull. His ribs pressed into the ground as he tried to disappear, but his eyes, large, glassy, a mixture of fear and defiance, remained open. In those eyes, faint as a candle, burned a stubborn spark, the hope that someone, anyone, might notice. That night someone did. He appeared like a silhouette at first, blurred by rain, carrying the weariness of a man who had walked too long under heavy skies. His steps were slow, unhurried, as though he carried no particular destination other than escape from the storm. The street lamp above him flickered weakly, giving shape to his figure. A coat darkened by rain, hair plastered to his forehead, eyes cast down against the wind. He might have passed by as countless others had. The city was full of shadows, and one more, small, fragile, hidden, was easy to ignore. But then he heard it, a sound so faint it could have been mistaken for the squeak of rusted metal or the whimper of water through a drain. He stopped. The rain filled the pause, drumming harder, as if trying to cover the sound. He tilted his head, squinting into the alley where the dumpster hunched like a broken spine. And then in the space between two lightning strikes, he saw them, two eyes glowing back, wide and terrified. The man's breath caught. For a moment, the storm disappeared. He knew those eyes, not the puppy, not the shape of the animal itself, but the language of that gaze, the raw, pleading silence of something on the edge of surrender. It reached inside him, clawing at a part of his soul he thought he had long buried. He stepped closer, slowly, as though approaching a wounded memory. The puppy did not move, his body stiffened, every instinct screaming to bolt, to vanish into the night. Yet hunger kept him rooted. His thin legs would not carry him far, and the hollow inside gnawed with such violence that even fear could not silence it. So he stayed, eyes fixed on the stranger, chest heaving in quick, shallow bursts. The man crouched, knees bending against the wet pavement, the cold soaking through his jeans. He did not speak at first. He simply lowered himself to the puppy's level, letting the storm rage above them. His eyes softened, his hand slowly extending, palm open. The puppy flinched, pressing harder into the shadows. "I see you," the man whispered, his voice nearly drowned by the rain. "It's okay, I see you." The words carried no command, no demand, only recognition. For the first time in countless nights, the puppy was not invisible. The storm howled around them, cars hissed by on slick streets, neon signs flickered in the distance. Yet in that narrow alley, under the weak glow of a broken lamp, time bent itself around the fragile tether between a lost animal and a stranger who had chosen not to look away. The puppy's eyes blinked against the rain as though weighing the risk of believing. The man stayed still, arm outstretched, patient in his quiet offering. The distance between them, barely 3 feet, felt like an ocean. But every rescue begins with an ocean that must be crossed. And so the night held its breath. The man's hand hovered there in the space between fear and trust, open and trembling slightly, not from cold alone but from the fragile weight of hope. He could feel the rain running down his sleeve, dripping from his fingertips, each drop landing softly on the wet concrete, as if time itself wanted to mark this moment. He didn't rush, didn't call out again. He only stayed, knees pressed into the soaked pavement, letting the silence speak for him. The puppy watched him with eyes that did not blink, pupils wide, head low. He had seen hands before, hands that threw rocks, hands that shoved, hands that reached only to push him away. But this hand was different. It did not strike, it did not move fast. It simply waited, patient as the rain. Still his body shook, torn between the instinct to dart back into darkness and the desperate need to believe that warmth might exist in the world. The man leaned closer, his breath visible in the cold air, mingling with the steam rising off the wet ground. He whispered again, softer now, almost as if he was afraid of frightening his own words. "It's okay, I'm not here to hurt you." His voice carried a tremor, not from fear of the animal but from the fear of rejection, because some part of him knew that this wasn't just about saving a puppy. It was about proving to himself that broken things could still reach for each other. A car's headlights swept across the alley, briefly flooding it with harsh white light. The puppy shrank back, ears flat, heart hammering. The man froze, holding his position, silently begging the little creature not to bolt. The light faded, leaving them in shadow again, only the faint glow of the street lamp keeping them tethered. The puppy lifted his head slightly, nostrils flaring, catching the scent of something human, damp wool, faint soap, and the unmistakable scent of another beating heart. The man slowly shifted, reaching into his coat pocket. He pulled out the remnants of a sandwich he had saved from lunch, bread softened by rain but still carrying the rich scent of meat. He placed it gently on the ground in front of him, pushing it closer, but not too close. His hand retreated, returning to its open stillness. The smell hit the puppy like a wave, awakening the hollow ache inside him, until it burned like fire. He hadn't eaten anything real in days, only scraps, scavenged from torn bags, bits of moldy bread, greasy bones licked clean. The scent before him was almost unbearable, so good it felt like a trick. His claws scraped softly against the concrete as he inched forward, then stopped, muscles tense, watching the man's every breath. The man lowered his gaze, as if to say, "I won't force you. The choice is yours." Minutes passed. The rain continued its relentless song, and then with a trembling step that felt heavier than mountains, the puppy moved closer. His belly almost brushed the ground as he crept forward, body ready to dart away at the slightest twitch. His nose reached the food first, quivering, nostrils wide. He sniffed, hesitated, then took the tiniest bite, his teeth chattering softly, as if expecting punishment to fall. None came. Only silence, only warmth radiating from the man crouched near. The puppy devoured the rest in seconds, hunger overwhelming fear. When it was gone, he licked the wet ground, desperate for every crumb. The man did not move. He only watched, his chest tightening at the sight. It wasn't pity that struck him. It was recognition. He knew what it was to be starved, not of food but of gentleness. When the puppy finally lifted his head, crumbs clinging to his whiskers, his gaze met the man's once more. Something had shifted. The distance between them was still wide, but now it was a distance crossed by hunger, by courage, by the smallest thread of trust. The man extended his hand again, slower this time, fingers spread, palm warm despite the cold. The puppy's ears twitched. His eyes darted from the hand to the man's face, searching for betrayal. And then, almost imperceptibly, he leaned forward, nose brushing against the skin. It was the faintest touch, like a question whispered into the night. The man's throat tightened. His instinct was to scoop the fragile body into his arms immediately, to shield him from the storm, but he held back. This had to be on the puppy's terms, so he simply held still, allowing the wet nose to linger, to sniff, When the tongue came a tiny trembling lick against his skin, the man's eyes burned with tears he hadn't expected. "There you are," he murmured, voice breaking. "You're safe now." The puppy flinched at the sound, but didn't retreat. Instead he inched closer, until his head brushed against the man's hand, fur rough and cold but alive. The man let his fingers curl slowly, gently, around the fragile skull, stroking once, twice. The puppy shuddered, half from fear, half from the foreignness of kindness. But he didn't pull away. The world outside went on, thunder rumbling, rain pouring, cars hissing down slick streets. But in that forgotten alley, something eternal unfolded. A stranger reached out, and a lost soul reached back. The man gathered his courage, sliding his other arm beneath the puppy's frail body. The animal stiffened, legs flailing weakly, but then collapsed against the warmth of the coat. For the first time in what felt like forever, the puppy was not standing against the storm. He was being carried through it. The man pressed the small, shivering body against his chest, pulling his coat around them both. He stood slowly, knees aching, water dripping from his hair into his eyes. He didn't care. He only held the life in his arms tighter, whispering against the rain, "I've got you." And for the first time that night, the puppy closed his eyes. The man carried the puppy through the storm as if he were carrying something made of glass. Each step measured, each breath heavy with the weight of responsibility he hadn't expected to bear. The city around him blurred, neon lights smeared across puddles, horns distant, the sharp scent of rain and oil rising from the asphalt. But none of it mattered. His world had narrowed to the fragile warmth pressed against his chest, the faint heartbeat fluttering beneath wet fur. By the time he reached his apartment, his coat was soaked through. His keys fumbled in the lock, fingers stiff from the cold, but he managed to push the door open, kicking it shut behind him. The sudden quiet was jarring. Gone was the storm's roar, replaced by the hush of a dim, modest room, walls painted in tired beige, a small couch sagging under years of use, books stacked unevenly on the floor. It wasn't much, but it was dry. He placed the puppy gently on a folded blanket near the heater. The animal resisted at first, scrambling weakly to his feet as though afraid of being abandoned again. His legs wobbled, his body too frail to stand, and he collapsed back into the folds of the fabric. His eyes darted around the room, walls, furniture, corners, each new shape an unknown threat. The man crouched beside him, voice soft. "You're safe, I promise." He moved slowly, peeling off his wet coat, then rummaged through a cupboard. Kneeling once more, he pressed the fabric gently against the puppy's fur, blotting away rain and grime. The puppy whimpered at first, flinching under each touch, but the man's hands remained steady, patient. Stroke by stroke he revealed the truth beneath the dirt. A coat that had once been soft, ears that drooped with weary innocence, eyes that now flickered with uncertainty rather than fear. When the towel was soaked, the man tossed it aside and fetched a bowl of water. He set it down carefully. The puppy sniffed, then lapped greedily, his tiny tongue darting as though afraid it might disappear. Watching him, the man felt something stir inside, a tenderness so sharp it almost hurt. He realized he was holding his breath, terrified that this fragile being might vanish if he looked away. In the kitchen he found scraps of boiled chicken left from the night before. He tore them into tiny pieces, placing them gently in front of the... The response was immediate. Hunger roared louder than fear. The puppy devoured the food, each bite desperate, each swallow a declaration that he wanted to live. The man sat back on his heels, heart tight, as he watched survival transform into the first flicker of When the food was gone, the puppy licked the floor, searching for more. The man chuckled quietly, surprised by the sound of his own laughter. It had been months, maybe years since he'd heard it echo in his home. "Easy, little one. There'll be more tomorrow." The heater hummed softly, warming the room, drying the damp edges of the night. The man fetched another blanket and laid it over the tiny body, careful not to startle him. The puppy shifted, a small sigh escaping as he curled deeper into the fold. His eyes drooped, but they never fully closed. Still wary, still caught between exhaustion and suspicion. The man sat cross-legged on the floor beside him, watching the rise and fall of the puppy's chest. He felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years, a raw vulnerability, a fragile sense of belonging. He thought about the silence that had filled his apartment before tonight, the empty dinners eaten in front of the television, the way loneliness had settled into his bones, like mold. And now here, in the most unexpected of ways, a creature lay beside him, breathing life into the quiet. When sleep finally claimed the puppy, it came like surrender. His body slackened, paws twitching faintly as if chasing something in a dream. The man reached out, hesitated, then let his hand rest lightly on the pup's side. The warmth was astonishing. The heartbeat beneath his palm was steady, fragile, but alive. He whispered into the dim room, words he didn't expect to speak. "You're not alone anymore." The storm raged outside through the night, battering windows, howling through alleys. But in the apartment, time slowed to a gentler rhythm, the hum of the heater, the soft breathing of a puppy who had finally found a place to rest, and the steady heartbeat of a man who had just begun to understand that rescuing another soul sometimes meant rescuing yourself. Morning broke pale and quiet, the storm having spent its fury. Light filtered through thin curtains, casting soft stripes across the floor. The man stirred awake on the couch, stiff from sleeping in an awkward position, his gaze drifting immediately to the blanket by the heat. The puppy was there, still curled, chest rising and falling with even breaths. Relief surged through him, sharper than coffee, more grounding than daylight. He knelt again, whispering softly, not wanting to wake him, but unable to stay silent. "Good morning, little one." The puppy stirred, eyes blinking open, ears twitching. For a moment, confusion clouded his gaze, as if he wasn't sure whether safety had been real or only a dream. But then he saw the man's face, gentle, waiting, familiar. His body his tail, small and hesitant, thumped once against the blanket. It was the smallest gesture, but to the man it was everything. That tail, that fragile movement, was a promise. Trust could grow here. The days that followed blurred into a rhythm the man hadn't known he needed. Each morning began not with silence, but with a faint whimper at the foot of his couch, followed by a tentative paw pressing against his leg. The puppy, no longer just a shadow in an alley, no longer trembling beneath a dumpster, was learning what mornings could mean: warmth, food, and the quiet presence of someone who noticed him. The man found himself changing too. He rose earlier, not out of duty to an alarm clock, but because of the fragile weight of expectation curled against his blanket. He cooked not only for himself, but for another mouth, carefully shredding chicken, mixing it with rice, watching the pup devour it with joy that seemed to ripple through the entire apartment. He began to laugh more, at small things, the way the puppy chased his own tail clumsily, or barked softly at his reflection in the window as if confronting a rival. Yet beneath these moments of light, doubts brewed quiet. In the stillness of night, when the puppy lay asleep, the man sat in the dim glow of a lamp and stared at him with a mixture of awe and fear. His heart had opened so quickly it startled him, but could he keep it open? His life was small, his paycheck barely stretched to cover rent and bill. He hadn't planned for this. He hadn't planned for anything really, not since the weight of his own losses had taught him to live cautiously, as though expecting every joy to vanish. The puppy stirred in his sleep, paws twitching, a soft whimper escaping his throat. The man leaned forward, brushing a hand gently over his fur, until the dream passed. The sound broke something inside him. He whispered, though no one was awake to hear, "I don't know if I'm enough for you." The next day he bought a small collar from a corner shop. It wasn't fancy, just simple fabric, frayed slightly at the edges, but it was a symbol. He slipped it gently around the puppy's neck, fastening it while murmuring reassurances. The puppy squirmed at first, pawing at the strange weight, but when the man scratched behind his ears, he relaxed. The man smiled, but inside he felt the heaviness of a vow forming. Outside the world went on. People rushed, cars honked, rain returned in passing showers. But inside the apartment, time slowed. The man began talking more, not just to himself, but to the small creature who followed him from room to room. "I should do laundry today," he'd mutter, and the puppy would tilt his head as though considering it. "Rent's due soon," he sighed, and the puppy's tail wagged, unconcerned. It felt absurd, but also grounding. He hadn't spoken aloud to anyone in months. Now,
He couldn't stop. One evening, he found himself lingering by the window, the city lights flickering in the distance. The puppy pressed against his leg, warm and insistent. He thought of the shelter a few blocks away, the one with posters taped to telephone poles, urging people to adopt or surrender responsibly. He'd walked past it countless times, never once looking in. Now the image of it haunted him. He could give the puppy up, he told himself. Someone with more space, more money, more certainty, someone better. But the thought hollowed him out. He looked down at the pup, who had fallen asleep with his nose pressed against his foot. The trust in that gesture was unbearable. To give him up now would be another abandonment, another proof that the world was crueler than hope dared believe. The man closed his eyes, guilt pressing against his ribs like iron. Days later, the puppy's energy surged, as if his body had finally remembered how to thrive. He barked at pigeons from the balcony, chased socks across the floor, skidded clumsily on linoleum. The man couldn't help but laugh, even when his belongings suffered under the chaos. Yet each burst of joy reminded him of the growing weight on his shoulder. Joy, he realized, was responsibility disguised. That night, the puppy curled beside him on the couch, head resting on his thigh. The man's hand moved instinctively, fingers tracing the soft rise and fall of his breathing. His mind wandered to the emptiness that had filled this room before, the silence after his father's funeral, the quiet years, when friends drifted away, the nights he told himself loneliness was safer than risk. He had built walls around himself, convinced that healing meant distance. But now a creature so small, so unassuming, had found the cracks in those walls and slipped through. The man felt exposed, but also alive in a way he hadn't in years. "I don't deserve you," he whispered. The words landed heavy, tasting of both fear and confession. The puppy shifted, licking his hand, tail thumping once, as if to say, "That doesn't matter." The man smiled faintly, though tears blurred his vision. He leaned back, letting the puppy climb onto his chest, tiny heartbeat drumming against his own. For the first time he let himself imagine a tomorrow where the silence was permanently broken.
But with imagining came dread. Tomorrow meant commitment. Tomorrow meant risk. Tomorrow meant he had to decide whether to protect this fragile miracle or surrender it to someone else. And so the weight of tomorrow pressed down on him, heavier than the storm that had first brought them together. The morning of the choice arrived quietly, without thunder or storm, without any sign that the world outside had shifted. But inside the man's chest, everything felt unsettled. The puppy was already awake, padding around the living room with a toy sock in his mouth, tail wagging clumsily. His joy was radiant, careless, the kind of joy that doesn't know it might be temporary. The man watched him, heart heavy, coffee cooling in his hand. For days the question had gnawed at him: keep the pup or surrender him to the shelter. Logic had rehearsed its arguments: rent, groceries, long hours, the thin margin of his life that barely held him up. He told himself the puppy deserved more, yet every time he looked into those eyes, wide with trust, he knew surrender would be a betrayal neither of them could survive. The man sat cross-legged on the floor. The puppy bounded over immediately, climbing into his lap, licking at his fingers as though greeting him after years apart. The man laughed softly, then covered his face with his hands. His chest heaved. "I don't know if I can give you what you need," he whispered through his palms. "But I can't let you go." The puppy pressed his nose into the man's chest, whining softly, paw resting against his shirt. The man lowered his hands, eyes wet. He saw not just an animal, but a mirror, both of them once abandoned, both of them carrying the ache of being unseen, both of them clinging to the smallest scrap of hope. He realized then that the question was not about worthiness, it was about love, and love he knew was never about deserving. That afternoon he walked to the pet store. The sky had cleared, the city washed clean by days of rain. He bought kibble, a leash, a proper collar that gleamed red against the puppy's dark fur. He carried them home with a sense of ceremony, as though buying more than supplies, as though buying the future itself. When he slipped the new collar around the pup's neck, fastening it with a click, something inside him solidified. The puppy shook his head, then bounded in a circle, tail wagging furiously, unaware of the weight of the gesture. But the man knew this was not temporary. This was not a pause before surrender. This was the beginning of forever. Still, forever required courage. That night, as the puppy slept, curled beside him, the man sat awake, staring at the ceiling. Shadows stretched across the room, familiar and strange all at once. He thought about his father, about the silence that had followed his loss. He thought about the years he had drifted, untethered, choosing solitude over risk, because solitude at least did not leave. And he thought about the storm, the eyes glowing from the dark, the moment he had reached out and been answered. He realized that he had been rescued too. In the weeks that followed, the apartment changed. Shoes bore tiny teeth marks. Blankets were claimed by muddy paws. The sound of barking replaced the silence, and laughter replaced the hollow echo of loneliness. The man adjusted, awkward at first, then with growing confidence, learning to schedule his days around feedings and walks, learning to leave space on the couch for a companion. He discovered parks he had never noticed, learned the rhythm of leash and stride, the language of wagging tails and eager eyes. Strangers began to stop him, smiling, asking about the pup. For the first time in years, conversations bloomed in his life, brief but real, each one stitching him further into the fabric of the world. The puppy grew, ribs no longer showing, eyes brighter, coat glossy under the sun. His bark grew louder, his leaps higher, his presence filling the apartment with life. Yet no matter how strong he became, he always returned to the same place at night, curled against the man's chest, heartbeat pressed to heartbeat. One evening, months later, they returned from a long walk, just as the sun was setting. The sky burned orange and pink, the city glowing with the kind of beauty most people hurry past. The man stopped, leash slack in his hand, watching the puppy bound toward a patch of grass, chasing the last rays of light. He felt a swell in his chest so fierce it almost hurt. The world had tried to tell him he wasn't enough, that love was temporary, that loss was inevitable. But here in this moment, he knew the truth. He had been chosen, not by fate, not by chance, but by the stubborn persistence of a creature who had once waited beneath a dumpster in the rain, too hungry to give up, too brave to let hope die. The puppy turned back, ears flopping, eyes bright, tail wagging with uncontainable joy. The man crouched, arms open. The dog sprinted to him, leaping into his embrace, paws muddy, tongue eager, heart alive. The man laughed, a sound full and unbroken, echoing into the fading day. As he held the puppy close, he whispered into his fur, voice steady now, "You're home, forever." The city moved on around them, cars rushing, people hurrying, lights flickering on one by one. But for the man and the once lost pup, time had crystallized into something eternal. No storm could undo this, no shadow could erase it. Two lives once fractured had found each other and fused into something whole. And so, under the painted sky of evening, the story closed not with silence, not with loss, but with the simplest, most enduring truth, that sometimes the smallest touch, offered in kindness, can change a life forever. Seasons shifted, and with them the rhythm of their lives. The puppy was no longer small enough to curl in the crook of the man's arm, but he still tried, sprawling awkwardly across his lap, paws hanging over the edge, head heavy against the man's chest. They had grown together, adjusting to each other's needs the way rivers carve valleys, slow, unrelenting, permanent. The man noticed how his own habits softened. He no longer reached for his phone first thing in the morning, but instead opened his eyes to the sound of padded paws and a cold nose nudging his cheek. Breakfast became ritual, a dance of pouring kibble and buttering toast, the quiet scrape of chairs across the floor punctuated by the thud of a wagging tail. What had once been silence was now music, the ordinary kind, the kind you didn't realize you missed until it filled your lungs again. At night, when the city glowed with neon, and the windows reflected fragments of their lives back at them, he would sometimes catch himself staring at the dog, at the way he sprawled belly up on the rug, or dozed with one ear cocked toward the hum of traffic. In those moments, a thought pressed against his chest. What if I hadn't stopped that night? What if I had walked past? The thought chilled him. He would lean down, burying his face in warm fur, whispering thanks to whatever stubborn strand of fate had tethered them together. But fate, like weather, was never done testing. One winter evening, a storm rolled in. Snow this time,
not rain. The streets grew slick, cars buried under layers of water. The dog, older now but still spirited, bounded into the drifts with reckless joy, leaping and plowing his muzzle into the powder as though discovering a secret world. The man followed, boots crunching, breath clouding in the frigid air. For a brief moment, he felt that same thread of fear from the first storm, that fragile knowledge of how easily life could be lost. But now it was different. Now, as the dog circled back, eyes bright, he felt anchored, tethered, not by fear but by the undeniable fact that they had saved each other once and could face anything again.
Years began to layer, one atop the other. Photographs filled shelves that had once been bare. The dog perched proudly on a couch cushion. The man crouched low in a sunlit park, both grinning into the camera. Quiet shots of winter coats and muddy trails. Friends who had drifted away began to return, drawn in part by the dog's charm, in part by the way the man himself had changed. Warmer, steadier, less hidden behind the walls he once thought necessary. The dog had opened a door that grief had locked. There were hard days, too, vet visits that made the man's stomach knot, long nights when work left him drained, moments of frustration when shoes were chewed or furniture scratched. But even in those moments, love did not falter. He realized that family was not the absence of difficulty, but the choice to stay, again and again, no matter the storm, no matter the snow. One autumn evening, when the dog was no longer quite a puppy but not yet old, they sat together on the fire escape watching the city burn gold under the setting sun. The man scratched behind familiar ears, feeling the steady heartbeat beneath fur. He thought about the boy he used to be, the one who had lost his father, who had learned too young how quickly the world could collapse, who had carried that ache like a stone in his pocket. He thought about the night he almost walked past, about the eyes that had looked at him through the rain, waiting. And he knew then, with a clarity so sharp it brought tears, that the rescue had never been one-sided. The city moved on around them, restless and alive, but he stayed still, letting the weight of the moment settle. A dog leaned into him. A man breathed deeper than he had in years. Somewhere far off, church bells rang, faint beneath the roar of traffic, and the sound felt like a benediction. The dog turned his head, resting it against the man's shoulder. The man closed his eyes. He didn't need to speak, didn't need to name what they were. It was written in every paw print on the sidewalk, every worn patch of couch where fur clung stubbornly. Every morning he woke to a wagging tail. They had been broken once, both of them. They had been lost, but now under the weight of twilight, with the city's heart beating around them, they were something else entirely. They were home.